Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is an old friend of the open source voice over IP community and Kamailio expert, and everybody knows Alex. So, Alex Balashov, founder of Evariste Systems and telephony consultant for a few years now, right?
Yeah, better part of 2 decades. Apparently, it's been 16, 17 years, something like that.
So, for the like two people that don't know you, would you like to give us a quick introduction?
Sure. So, my name is Alex Balashov, and I am based in Northeast Georgia in the US. I'm natively Russian, but I've been here since for time immemorial. And I indeed do primarily Kamailio and kind of class 4 ITSP work. So my existence historically in this industry has been very PSTN focused and very focused on kind of being Mario the plumber rather than in the application space. So it leads to a nice complementarity with people who are involved in the PBX and application space because I usually am interested in entirely different aspects of this than they are.
Yeah,
And
and
uh, and I've been involved with OpenSARE since
since
2006, 2006, in some fashion or another. And then I went out on my own full time in 2008, and very soon after that, CSRP was born. And those events are, of course, very entwined. So, yeah, I look up, and apparently it's been a better part of 2 decades now. To be honest, I hadn't really thought through all the implications of that.
Oh yeah, let's not go there. There's already too many things. On every episode we do, I managed to say something that puts a date on me, like like naming
Yeah,
a defunct Linux distribution or something like that. I
Mandrake.
don't know. Yeah, it,
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'm accustomed to thinking of myself as a newcomer to open source VoIP. I was not part of the OG free switcher asterisk set in the early mid 2000s, and and think of myself as a relatively recent arrival. And I guess that's just the aging process.
well, I mean, the first question I'd like to ask you is, well, first of all, what is CSRP? Since it's your main
Yeah. So
project right now.
Yeah, so CSRP is a class 4 routing platform that is used to provide SIP trunking. It's the middle box that sits between traditionally, in the cultural moment of SIP trunking, of the 2010s, 2000s, you can think of it as the class 4 switch, if you like, that sits between PSTN origination and termination providers on one hand and PBXs and application servers on the other. So it's that kind of switch platform, and its main marquee claim to fame has always been high performance LCR, and of course it does CDR generation and rating and a bunch of the technical twiddling and adaptation that has been necessary, to make this PBX talk to that PSTN provider. And I can tell you a little bit about its heritage, which is kind of curious. But that's basically what it is. The In the late 2000s, when I started doing Kamailio work and becoming increasingly specialized in this space, I'd come from a few years of not exactly hardcore telco background, but unlike many people who ended up in VoIP, I came into this by way of the ISP route, and I got increasingly interested in kind of classical telecom and voice. And a very young me was under the misapprehension that all this ISDN and SS7 stuff, maybe it wasn't the future, but this was still very hot and happening, and this is where the real serious expertise is. So I went down the carrier and CLEC route for a while as an operational type person. Maybe not a switch tech per se, but had a lot of atmospheric exposure to classical big iron switch platforms.
Mhm.
And a lot of exposure to kind of the North American PSTN folk traditions, if you like. So
Oh,
then, in 2008, 2009, 2010 comes along, and I kind of realized, no, I mean, maybe this SIP stuff isn't so hokey, and that's where this is all going after all. And I wouldn't call it a reversal per se. I mean, those worlds were always kind of integrated in what I did career-wise prior to that point. But I, obviously had to make a little bit of a left turn there. And so, every product and every system that arises in this kind of organic fashion has some kind of ethos or a message behind it, right? And my message implicitly, it was a tacit message, but it was the tacit message, which I've uttered explicitly at in some points at various Kamailio worlds, I'm sure, is that the PSTN is serious stuff. When you really need to make a call, you should holler at the PSTN. It's there for you, and it's serious, and it's not going anywhere. And despite all this hokey IP interconnect and uh, um, peer-to-peer calling business, the PSTN is where the buck really stops. And I think that's a crystallization of my own background in the carrier world. That's
Mhm.
a reflection of the fact um, that I had a somewhat, I perceive to be a somewhat uncommon intersection of knowledge between the original Bell system. I kind of rapidly caught up to those folk traditions. I was not an old timer, clearly, but I had caught up rapidly. There was a lot of rapid uptake of that kind of stuff. And then, the IP IT world on the other. And so the implicit message behind CSRP was that, Kamailio is great as a kind of low level SDK, but it doesn't come with the finished packaged business logic and solutions to business problems required for real world interconnection to the PSTN. And at least especially in a North American focused context, we're going to solve them for you. And so that's kind of where CSRP was born. It was born out of being repeatedly asked to build various kinds of custom trunking platforms or things that are substantially like trunking platforms in the late 2000s. And like all consultants, getting a bit tired of stamping out the same thing over and over and
Mhm.
creating a kind of toolkit, a bundle of assets and templates and reusable trinkets that eventually, you realize you just need to coalesce and promote this into a product. With all of the organic, pluses and minuses that entails. It's a bit of a chaotic evolution, but it's also a very market validated one. So that's where CSRP appeared in the early 2010s. It's a trunking platform with
Well,
Kamailio under the hood.
that is really impressive. So let me ask a couple questions that I. So as you know, we've known each other and seen each other at conferences for a long time. I live far lower in the stack. I'm an application builder. We build out applications for end users, especially myself. I've been a
Well, it's
consultant
quite
for.
impressive to me. I don't know how to do any of
Good
that.
thing you're- And so, first of all, what's the difference between a class 4 and a class 5 router? Because that's something that pops up all the time.
hmm So this is a American Bell systemism that I don't think necessarily
Oh
is
wow.
is very globally translatable. It is sort of entered into marketing lore, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily very helpful of me to use it outside of this hemisphere. Um, Broadly speaking, a class 5 switch platform in the architecture of the traditional telephone network is an is an end office switch that's a telephone
Hmm.
exchange that serves real subscribers, real world landlines, actual telephones, handsets. While a class 4 switch is a switch of switches, it's basically a hub of a hub that connects different spokes together. So in the North American PSTN architecture, without getting too much into the weeds of it, a class 4 switch would be what all the class 5 switches would connect back to. And that's how they would swap traffic amongst themselves and will route that traffic onto long distance carriers and so forth.
Hmm. And does any of this relate to IMS?
Not overtly, uh, not in any kind of straightforward way.
So it's a different network. Yeah, there's IMS
Yeah,
is for
very much
mobile.
so.
IMS is for mobile, right?
It
And
is. It is, and it's very much despite the outward appearance of catering to it in the open source world, it is still very much a walled garden, in my opinion.
so let's delve into the nitty gritty. uh, what do users of CSRP use to actually connect to the PSTN? Because I only know SIP. Do carriers? Do you need hardware to connect to the PSTN at some point? I assume so.
No, it's a SIP trunking
Oh.
platform. So it has Kamailio at its core and uses Kamailio
Mhm.
SIP stack for all the signaling, with all the pluses and minuses that entails. But no, it doesn't have any adaptation layers for any other signaling technology.
So if you were to bring in something like you were a company that's bringing in legacy hardware, etc., you would have something else converting the PSTN side, so probably SS7 to SIP,
Mhm.
some other hardware, and then CSRP would talk to you this hardware,
Yeah, that's
presumably.
indeed. That's something we haven't seen for quite a few years now. However, in
Hmm.
the late 2000s, early 2010s, we had a number of customers that had equipment such as the Cisco AS5400, which is an ISDN to SIP gateway, and it was deployed for precisely that purpose.
Those have gone away then.
Well, not as much as you might think. Certainly, they're more scarce than they were 10 years ago. But there's still an awful lot of TDM out there. It's something that I think is a little bit understated.
Yeah, I think every time I work with a telco, I feel like they come from a different decade at the very least. So I'm not surprised there's a lot of older stuff out there.
There is, and the way that they operate internally is, I think, a reflection of that as much as anything else. So not only do they still operate a lot of TDM and what you would consider to be legacy technology, but they also have pretty legacy business processes. At least in North America, that's true, where everything, of course,
Oh,
is very, very federated and very decentralized. In North America, it's extremely common for very, nationally critical central routing databases that stitch the PSTN together to be distributed as access databases, large Excel spreadsheets, and that kind of thing. You wouldn't believe. We've had something like BGP since the 80s, and they can't come up with a better way of updating route tables and and switch translations and what seemed like really, really critical building blocks of society.
yeah, I think that's the case with Europe too. There's a lot of legacy stuff. So speaking of legacy and newer versions, I know CSRP2 is coming out. What
Mhm.
are the news on that front?
Yeah, and I don't mean to defraud anyone with the perception that this is a release announcement. We hope to release it later this summer. It is not available at this time. Um,
Sorry.
CSRP2 is, I think, a much needed update that reflects, and I think this is really, I think, maybe the heart of the conversation we should have, that reflects a shift in the winds of the market and
Mhm.
the grassroots demand for a different kind of routing platform, I think, in the 2020s than in the 2000s and 2010s. CSRP1, as we just talked about with TDM and stuff, there's a long tail of demand for a certain kind of platform. But
Mhm.
the entire ontology, the vocabulary of CSRP1 is that of a 2010 era SIP trunking provider, meaning that we connect to origination providers and receive inbound calls on DIDs, and our purpose is to send them to customer PBXs. And when we receive calls from a customer PBX, we route them outbound to termination vendors via LCR. And that's a certain type of business model that the product catered to, I think, exceptionally well. But the use cases in that we see predominantly now, and again, this is still kind of our bread and butter, and I think what most of our customers do, and maybe some of them will continue to do for the foreseeable future. But there's definitely some things in 2024 that make this whole proposition, and in particular that way of framing it from a provisioning and business process and interface and integration perspective, make it seem rather uncontemporary. So the main news on that front is that CSRP2 takes, there's a couple pieces of news, but one of them is philosophically that CSRP2 takes a much less presumptuous view of what it is that you're doing. Um, Rather than taking inbound calls from the PSTN and sending them to customers, and taking outbound calls from customers and sending them to the PSTN,
Mhm.
there's a lot more allowance for a more generic and a more abstract understanding of how you route calls internally. I don't mean to make it seem like we succumbed to a kind of second system effect where everything has become impossibly abstract, but I think this brings us more in line with how other soft switch platforms and, dare I say, SBCs operate, uh, in terms of calls entering a vertex and exiting a vertex and having a lot of flexible routing logic underneath. It's going to work more like that. The second thing is that existing CSRP is very much, you know, designed to be deployed into the core networks of service providers and not
Mhm.
necessarily at the edge. So it's very UDP first. It assumes that everything is UDP for efficiency. that UDP is kind of the gold standard to which everything should be reduced. And in reality, that's not the world we live in anymore, not for compliance reasons, not for stir shaken reasons, not for any number of other reasons. So there, CSRP2 takes a very first class view of TCP and TLS and SRTP and these seemingly obvious requirements of doing business in the modern world as a service provider. And you might say, well, those have been around for quite a while. You're a bit late to the party. And
Hmm.
there's some truth to that. But again, we're talking about the interfaces that are you typically find within service provider cores, very far from applications and very far from end user devices. And that has evolved along a slightly different track.
Well, that's nice. I mean, the fact that it's going to be appealing to a wider audience probably means someone is going to try and play with CSRP in front of FreeSwitch and similar systems. So, what's the relationship between CSRP and FreeSwitch or Asterisk or systems that ilk?
Actually, it's quite close. I would say they're intimately entwined for a majority of our customers. Uh, I think volumetrically speaking, the most common application of FreeSwitch and Asterisk is still, the PBX, whether as a virtual construct within a hosted PBX platform of some kind, or individuated PBXs. Uh, if we discount that for its relative lack of imagination, the next biggest category that comes along is application delivery systems of all kinds. And I think we're starting to see this metamorphosize in a much bigger way than before as well, where, because of this AI moment that we're in with
Mm-hmm.
TTS and next new generations of voice transcription, I think there's a much bigger emphasis on the application side for integration paths, connectors, various audio syncs and generic ways of taking speech and rapidly shuffling it off here and connecting it there and so forth. So I think there's a lot of interest in that. CSRP doesn't directly participate in that as a
Mm-hmm.
relatively basic
Yeah.
layer of SIP plumbing, but that's what a lot of our customers are doing. I would say that our most significant, most active customers who have the most non-trivial use cases for CSRP, in particular ones that call for more of a CSRP2 type uh, routing philosophy, more flexible one, a more responsive one that isn't just inward and outward, are the ones who are delivering applications, and we see a lot more free switch there.
That's good. Yeah, FreeSwitch. I mean, we love FreeSwitch. We're big fans, and
We're
of
quite
course,
partial
well,
ourselves.
yeah, it's a great compliment to anything like Kamailio or CSRP when you're trying to do application level routing, etc. And okay,
Absolutely.
so when is the next version of CSRP coming out?
Well, that's really holding my feet to the fire. Our hope is for a late summer, August release. There are a variety of things that could push that back. There are not as many things that could bring it forward. But that's what we're shooting for August.
So
And
you can join us at ClueCon in mid-August, and if Alex is going to be there, you can ask him why has not released CSRP2 yet.
well, it depends. Are we talking about the first few days of August?
I think it's the second week.
Ah, yes, yes. Um, yeah, and indeed, I might be there. Uh, there's probably, if we're talking about CSRP2 and what's new, I think it's worth mentioning parenthetically as a kind of PS, that there are a variety of handouts would only be of interest to existing customers with their existing grievances with CSRP1. Like, for instance, CSRP's GUI has never been its strength. It's the kind of GUI that systems people would build. In that it's a fine CRUD interface, but it doesn't really enable workflows that actually make things easier. Um, and in terms of both RESTful API and integration path quality, I think CSRP2's overall one of its biggest developmental priorities is to shift that and iterate that and really provide a solid user experience as much as a class 4 switch platform can provide a solid user experience. The strength of CSRP1 has always been more in its performance and sort of the 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 technical merits of the back-end architecture, if it's not so immodest to say so. But the user experience is the one that you would typically find in systems that are built by people who are good at doing the other.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to. I need to sit down and learn some of those systems, mostly because they're becoming more important. And well, you mentioned earlier you're getting closer to the edge.
Mhm.
Do you think the 5G edge computing capabilities are going to be a factor in CSRP adoption, or is it something you could deploy on a private cell, for example, to route your calls around, or is it a different type of technology?
Potentially. That's not the use case that I most immediately had in mind. Where I think we're getting closer to the edge is, well, in a couple different cases. One is that we simply want to be closer to the edge than we were before, in terms of adding value and providing, signaling adaptation from, say, SIP over TLS to TCP or UDP or whatever. Uh, it used to be the case that we just didn't touch that, and the question you get from customers is, okay, well, you have such a nice interface box that talks to this and this and not this. So part of it is just driven by shifting demands from um, our typical customer. But I think another factor there is that the architectural complexity of service provider networks, especially in a public cloud context, is growing. There is a need for a more dynamic and responsive way to assemble the building blocks of a VoIP platform, both in terms of on-demand resources and also the kinds of ways in which you connect uh, to different elements of this. So we were talking about, for example, AI and transcription and all this. Uh, there is a need for a system that is more imaginative and more responsive to the demand to involve third parties, partners, interconnection partners, white label resellers, other elements of the whole package that's being delivered that requires us to look beyond the PSTN service provider and be able to treat these entities not necessarily as carriers who provide inbound or carriers who provide outbound, but really peers, it, it, peers that are interconnected with at the core.
Yeah, and I to that I think the challenge at this point has become, from my experience, has become standardizing interactions with carriers a little. So maybe if everybody adopted something that's standard based like CSRP, we'd have a much easier life.
Well, I'm sure our competitors would say the same for their platforms. Speaking of which, using a SIP proxy at the core undeniably involves some technical trade-offs, and uh, highly standardized carrier interactions are not one of them. Uh, as you know, a proxy is a relatively thin adaptation layer in the sense that, for the most part, it's call leg A in, call leg A out, and pretty much garbage in, garbage out. And it's very inflexible in terms of the adulterations it can make to kind of the fundamental constitution of a SIP message. There's things that proxies can add and remove, but they're pretty limited. So if you want something that's extremely liberal in what it accepts and
Mm.
conservative in what it emits, you probably would be wise to go with a more traditional B2B UA architecture. And you can be absolutely sure that we have some customers who have had a need for this, and we usually recommend FreeSwitch.
Well, that's a great recommendation for sure. And go check out Frizzwich.
Yeah.
It's a great platform for sure. And well, yeah, I think I haven't asked you the question to start with. How did CSRP come into being? Like, why did you start building it?
Well, we started
That's
building it. I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but we started building it because we were being asked to build custom trunking platforms with
mhm.
a OpenSARE, later Kamailio foundation at the core over and over. And while they differed in some of their intricacies and implementational details, since it's custom work, there was definitely a common theme that united them. And we got tired of doing that over and over. And so that is a way that a lot of products come into being. They really are just a response to a pretty direct market need. And of course, there's pluses and minuses to building a product that way, right? I mean, the plus is that you can kind of find funding for building bits of it relatively straightforwardly, and that the what you're building is being validated by the market more or less in real time because there are real world customers actually willing to pay for it. You're not imagining use cases or constructing an ideal of what a customer might want. So you get very familiar with their operational intricacies and what exactly they want and exact way that they want it. On the other hand, it leads to a pretty chaotic evolution. There's
Hmm.
not necessarily there's a sense that it's a bit of an eclectic grab bag of different kinds of things, and uh, from a product management perspective, that can get a little unwieldy as well.
Yeah, I assume I understand it. So because if you're funding a product using your customers' input and they're paying for the work, you need to build whatever what they need and not necessarily what someone else would need. So sometimes it's
That's right.
we we,
That's right. And,
we
and,
all
and we
had that.
obviously, yeah, and we obviously dialed in that compromise in a way that tries to achieve both, but it's a very imperfect process. So, and people often underestimate this, but in my opinion, educating your customers on what they need is a very important function too. Sometimes they don't know that they need it. So, I think that you don't want to create a product for which there is no demand and doesn't have product market fit clearly. But in
Mhm.
terms of articulating and shaping how the customers should do what it is that they want to do, I think it's okay to have an opinionated product that makes what in your opinion is a sort of best practical prescription for doing it in the most flexible way. And we didn't necessarily get a lot of chances to do that with the or kind of customer driven development of CSRP1.
So is CSRP is not open source, right?
Well, it's built on a open source technology stack, of course. Um, but no, I mean the core of what's being provided is commercial and it is closed source. That's right. Uh, it's I think we take a kind of open source friendly, transparent approach to it. Not in the sense that we open source the code, but in the sense that most of the config files and most of the value added components of it are free for customers to inspect and even in some cases modify or contribute to. We don't make an effort to have an extremely black box approach to it.
Well, I think that's the best way to do it. And well, reach out to Alex, see if CSRP is right for you, and I'm sure it's going to be able to help you with a lot of things. And I feel like it's a great product. Looking at the screenshots, reading the documentation, etc. I'm not from that world, but I understand what it does. It means it's a very good platform, and it's easy to bring in your stack. And well, last question: what are next conferences you'll be attending in case you're traveling in the near future?
Well, I've slowly been warming up to traveling for conferences again after the pandemic when I think that was on pause for virtually everyone. Um, The only actual event that I have gone to so far is the Astracon section of IT Expo, and that's largely because I was invited to speak there. Um,
Hmm.
I haven't done any international travel since 2019, since before the pandemic, and I rather miss it. Uh, so I have certainly considered some events in Europe as a way to kind of dust off those cobwebs. ClueCon for me at this point is an open question and a real possibility. Uh, but other than that, the only other event that is really on my radar that I wasn't necessarily on my radar before is ITW, and it's very likely I'll be back at IT Expo in South Florida next year as well.
Oh, I love
But
IT Expo. I will go again this year.
and you and you were there this past February.
I think I missed. No, we were there. Right, you're right. Yeah, it's been.
Oh, so pity we didn't cross
There's
paths.
Yeah, it's we were going Enterprise Connect right after, so I was there for just a couple of like 24 hours. I was traveling
M-
towards between customers.
my
Great.
most my most well established memory of you and conferences is playing Cards Against Technology and that the 2018 Astracon. I think it was in Orlando. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, everybody should do that. We'll do it again in at ClueCon whenever we have a chance. It's gonna be fun. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. CSRP is a great platform. Check it out. CSRP 2 is coming out soon, trademark. And you can ask Alex all sorts of questions about the next iteration. And well, hope we'll see you at ClueCon. And thank you, Alex, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Bye.